Hi everyone, I'm here to talk to you about a new data platform that we've been developing for the last 2 years. Now, I don't have to tell you that it's a really interesting time to be talking about waste. As we know, Craig Rucastle last year raised public awareness about waste issues in the community, which I'm sure most of us are aware about, and then the China National Sword policy hit, and we're having extensive conversations about waste and the impact it's having and how we as a country deal with our waste. But for me, it's kind of always been a really interesting time to talk about waste. I'm personally interested in how we move from the linear materials economy that we've all been participating in since the Industrial Revolution started into the circular materials economy. Again, I don't need to tell this room about circular materials, and Guy Pritchard certainly helped us understand the different spaces. But when you really dig into the space and work with people in this space quite extensively, what you realise is that the circular economy is a business working with another business, perhaps with some NGOs, with other groups of people, with consumers, with end markets, with export markets. And if those things don't line up, and if they don't work, then the circular economy doesn't work. And if those different entities don't really understand what good practice looks like or best practice looks like, then they won't know what they're doing and we won't get to this point. Which is what I want to talk to you about today, because NABERS, the program I work for, sets benchmarks for particular types of buildings and rates their operational performance, and we're hoping to help in this space with our waste rating. So firstly, about NABERS, for those of you that haven't heard of us before, we are the National Australian Built Environment Rating System. We've been around for 20 years, and we rate primarily commercial office buildings for operational efficiency, but we also rate all of these other ones. So for office buildings, we rate for energy, water, waste, and indoor environment, which is the quality of the indoor environment of that building. In shopping centres, we rate for energy and water, with a waste rating hopefully coming by end of calendar year. In hotels, again, energy and water, and in data centres, just energy. And what's really important about these ratings is that we rate for operational efficiency. We don't rate for design, we rate for actual data that comes from the building when it's got occupants in it, and we work out what that looks like. We use a very simple scale, and we call this the language for sustainability. We use a 6-star rating scale, where for every single building in our rating system, for any type of rating, a 3-star is average performance for that type of building and that type of rating. 6 stars is market leading, and 2 stars and below, you've probably got some low-hanging fruit you can work on very quickly to get yourself up to average performance. Where we find this really useful and where this has the power is that, as we know in this space, it can be incredibly hard to communicate the complexity of the different actions and activities that lead to improved sustainability performance. But what you can do is you can turn around to your board and you can turn around to your C-suite and say, we're currently a 3-star building, and they'll say, but why is the building down the road 5 stars? And you say, well, here are all of the reasons why, and here's how we could do better. So we get some of our key portfolio managers set targets to get to 5 stars, and then their sustainability officers and their facilities managers get the funding that they need to get to that point. So that's why it's been such a powerful language for communication. We've been tracking our what we've achieved in this space. So these are for energy ratings, these numbers. And what we've found is that for buildings that rate consecutively year on year, on average, by the 9th rating, they've dropped their carbon emissions by 40%. And that's through things such as chiller upgrades and HVAC upgrades, through improved like internal computer management techniques, all those sorts of things, better designs of lifts. So this is for the energy space, and this is the change that we've made in the market. We're hoping to do the same thing for waste, but what I need to tell you is that we currently have a waste rating, but it's not been very well known, it's not been very well taken up. In the first 3 quarters of this financial year, we had over 1,000 ratings for commercial office buildings for energy. We had 3 for waste. Just, you know, I've got a bit of work to do. Yeah, well, we've had a few more since then, Mike. So the reason for that, and it's a very good reason for that, is that the rating method as previously written, so we write a method, it's called the rules on how you're supposed to do all these ratings so that we can compare those buildings. The rating method for waste required a certified waste assessor, so certified by my program, to be on site in a commercial office building for 10 consecutive days doing a waste audit. Now, you guys know that's, who's going to pay for that? No one. So what we've been doing for the last 2 years is taking consultation, taking feedback, and coming up with a better way to do a waste rating. When we did this, we went and spoke to industry. So we spoke to a group called the Better Buildings Partnership down in Sydney that covers most of the major property portfolios across Australia, and said, apart from improving your diversion from landfill, and in part from improving your waste separation, what is it that also we might be able to help you with? And these are the things that they said to us. They said, we would love it if you could also help us with regular, accurate and granular data from our waste contractors. They said, we're getting data, we're getting invoices, we understand what it looks like on a monthly basis. But the reason we've been able to make change in energy is because we've had interval data. The reason we can make change in water is because we can get access to our building management system and it can tell us what water's doing on a daily basis. We cannot do that with waste at the moment. So what we've been doing for the last 2 years is working with those buildings and with some waste companies who come onto our pilot to try and get that granular data so that buildings can understand and make changes sooner and can work out what's going wrong sooner. They also said we get inconsistent waste reporting from different contractors. And what we had was major property portfolios combining reports from 3 or 4 different waste companies into really clunky, humongous spreadsheets, and then running reports and sort of having to have it churn in the background for a couple of hours. So we said we might be able to help you with that. And the last thing that they asked us about was that they couldn't track their supply chain effectively. And as we know, increasingly sustainability is about making sure that what's happening down the supply chain is actually what you want to happen down the supply chain. So they said our waste contractors are telling us this happens, but we don't know for sure, and we'd like to know. We can have that conversation, but if you can help us with that as NABERS, as an extra rating system, that would help us have that better conversation with our waste companies. So this is where we're at. We hope we've designed something that meets the needs of commercial buildings, is transparent and credible, because that is the backbone of NABERS. If we're not transparent and credible, then people won't come and work with us and work on our rating system. But also that looks at the realities of operating in Australia today and for the next 10 years. The benchmark. So that star rating that you saw before is always based on a benchmark. So for waste, we've decided that we're going with a recycling rate. And when I say recycling rate, what I mean is diversion from landfill. The reason we're doing this as opposed to, say, total materials generated on site, which we know is actually a better measure of environmental outcomes, because what we want to do is reduce materials generated on site rather than necessarily improve the recycling rate, although both are fantastic, is NABERS only rates for things that are within the operational control of a building. We don't rate for things they can't control, because that's not particularly fair. So when we went to our building owners and said, what is it we said, can we do total materials generated on site? Can we do waste intensity? They said, look, that'd be great, but we can't control what that bank does when it brings in all of that paper. We can't control what that company does when it brings in all of those computers and then wants to change their computers over every 2 years. What we can control is the bin configuration. What we can control is making sure they have the right place to put things at end of life. And what we can control is what our cleaners do. So this is where we've ended up with this as our measure of performance for commercial office buildings. It'll be for shopping centres. If we go to tenancies, we might actually start looking at materials generated, because they've told us tenants have control over that. So perhaps in the future we'll go there. What NABERS also does is tries to make sure it compares similar buildings with similar buildings across the country. So for energy, we have something called a climate adjustment, where a building in Brisbane has a slightly different number behind the scenes than a building in Melbourne. So they have the same star rating for energy performance, but we actually take climate into account. How we're doing that with waste is by saying everything in that mandatory column has to be reported. If you collect that waste stream on site, you have to give us 12 months of data for that waste stream. Or if our assessors find it on site, then they've got to go and find that information. So that means we have a core set of wastes that we know are generated in most office buildings in Australia, so we can compare like with like. But what we also know is that increasingly good practice means that you're collecting the stuff under optional. And so we want to be able to reward good practice and indicate what good practice looks like. So any of those wastes on the right-hand side, if you add that to our data platform, it will improve your recycling rate and therefore improve your star rating. We will be adding more in the future as we go through different buildings. Now, my abstract talked about data platform, and this is the engine behind what we're doing. So those of you who may be familiar with our NABERS energy and water ratings know that we've had this desktop application for a number of years. It's a bit clunky and kind of data input heavy. So we've been developing for the last 2 years a much more intuitive interface. So this is just a screen grab of our bin setup. So every single building goes through this and sets up their bins that exist on their building. That's a really quick snapshot of how our audit data works, because like every good waste management system, we've got contamination audits and numbers to be filled in there. How the whole thing works. So there is an algorithm that sits behind this rating that takes raw data. So the first step is that we can take waste data from any credible source. So that could be on-site scales in a building. That could be from your waste management company. It could also be from a waste consultant that you pay to take data and make sure it's really clean. So we are working with waste companies, making sure they get the data. That data goes onto the platform. We've got a standard Excel spreadsheet that can be generated off the back end of any reporting system. And we then apply some adjustments to that. So the first one is a density adjustment. If we cannot get weight data, we will happily take bin counts on site, because we know where waste data is at the moment is most buildings will have bin counts. They won't have actual weight, like weight of every single bin. So we'll take a density adjustment off that, where we take a site density. We'll then apply a contamination rate. So that's either our standard average contamination rate, or if you do a contamination audit on site, we will apply that rating. And finally, because one of the things we're trying to do is improve waste data so that everyone has a sense of what better waste data looks like, but also because NABERS needs to rate on reliable waste data, we have a data integrity adjustment, which means that if you give us weight-based data that is reliable, you get that data as read. But as the data becomes less and less reliable with a few more assumptions and a bit more averaging going on, we'll just drop the star rating slightly to account for that confidence interval that we know is there. Off the back of that, you can generate a waste rating, which tells you where your building is on that benchmark performance system I was discussing earlier. Or you can generate waste performance reports that you can share within your company or external to your company. So the data platform will generate graphs that are quite standard that you can drill into and then share internally. I spoke before about our star rating system. So these are the percentages that currently we've set for office buildings in Australia. They will be different for different types of office buildings. So what you'll see is that we think a 6-star building, a market-leading building, is 74% recovery rate and above. And for those of you that have worked in the space for quite a while, you know that's actually probably about right, that it tends to peter off after 65%, and everything beyond 75 is incremental gains and quite difficult to get. So we think a building who gets above that is doing quite well. The average building of the sample size we had was 36.4%. So you'll see that's where the average star rating sits, is in between 32 to 46%. And if you're under 18%, well, you know, maybe we've got a lot of work to do there to get you up to scratch. I spoke about the data management and the data reporting. So this is our dashboard. This is what you see when you first log in to the platform. And like Guy, I wish I could show you the dynamic online version, but I've done enough of these talks now not to trust necessarily how stuff works. So you'll just get screen grabs, and I'll just kind of talk about it a bit. So this is what you see in the first instance. It is dynamic, however. So this is an internal product. We've developed this with our own in-house developers. And that first graph gets generated. You can drill into any one of those lines to get day-by-day data. So if you've got something happening, say, in this one, that very first line, you can drill in and find out what's gone on there. Probably sort of it's a double up on data, or perhaps, and then you can go double check your billing's been done properly. Or the one that's very low, go and check that as well. I will say this is all test data, by the way. We're using this to test the platform, so this is not a real building. It is dynamic in that the graph on that side is exactly the same graph, but what you'll see, have I got a pointer? Yeah, there, oh, wow, is that general waste has been turned off. And it's a click through, so all you have to do is turn on and off those waste types, and then it will generate the report that you need for the waste type that you're after. So that looks like a recycling report to me. It's very easy drop down. You can then share that in internal reports and update it on like any billboards you've got around the place, anything like that, so you can use it that way. We've got one of our major portfolio companies who has actually been giving her facilities managers access to their building as viewing rights only, so that they can go in regularly and see what's happening with their waste. And she's seeing improvements from that perspective. So she's been one of our pilot users, and that's one of the benefits she's been seeing. One of the other graphs is that one. So that's percentage of total weight, but also if you hover over any of, where is it? Nope, not working. If you hover over any of those colours, it will give you the actual tonnage number. So you can sort of read those things off. And again, you can turn things on and off to generate the graph you're after. The platform will also let you do any time period. So you can specify a month, 6 months, 12 months, very specific day. So it's really quite dynamic in terms of a reporting tool. And last but not least, it'll generate these numbers for you. So total tonnes, waste intensity, because we do think that people need to understand their waste intensity even if we're not rating for it, and changes in recycling rate. And for those of you that understand waste data, you can tell that's definitely a test building, because that's a massive improvement which probably doesn't happen in a real building. Finally, because the waste data is coming in from various sources, if you need an easy way to download all of the data, so if you're a bit of a data nut like Guy was a minute ago, you can go play with all of that data, download it, muck around with it to your heart's content. It's driven by, as I said, a very simple drag and drop backend system. So this is this is one of two screens that a waste contractor will see if they get access to the platform. It's just this screen where they can drag and drop their reports, and the one next to it where they can set up some database relationships. So what that means is, as a building manager, they get access to all the data, but we're not having the situation where different waste companies are seeing what the other waste company is doing, because we understand that would be a very, very problematic issue from a data confidentiality perspective. So why this focus on data? So if NABERS rates for operational performance, we don't tend to tell people how to improve what they do. We just say, this is where you're at compared to other buildings. If you want to go and improve that, then we recommend you go and speak to the market about how to improve that. So our job is not to tell people how to improve, it's just to tell them whether they have or haven't improved. But what I've found over my career of working with business sustainability is that what gets measured gets managed. So if people don't understand what their data's doing, if they can't see the trends and they can't see it in an engaging way that they can communicate to other people, then we don't get improvements. So what the benefits we're seeing from this, notwithstanding the star rating, which helps people understand where they are, is if you can see that data more frequently in that format, you might have a better case to argue for internal behaviour change programs. You might have a better case to argue for better waste separation. And you might have a better case to argue for that contract potentially being renegotiated or changed if that's what needs to happen. So this is where we see the benefits for the users of the platform. 2 minutes, brilliant. I'm going to run through pilot data. We ran a pilot. We ran a pilot with 21 buildings. Of those, we had 17 actually come and play with us and upload data, which we think is a realistic number. Now, you've got to keep in mind that these are companies who volunteered buildings, so they've probably given us the slightly better performing buildings when you look at the numbers I'm about to show you. And of course, it's a very small sample size. Our pilot was about usability and qualitative findings, not necessarily quant. The average recycling rate, though, was pretty much on target, if you remember that 36.4% average. Our waste intensity, 10.5 kilograms per metre squared. And what I want to say is there was absolutely no correlation between those two numbers. Our best recycling performer was our worst waste intensity performer. Very interesting. What we also found fascinating, so remember that screen I showed you about bin setup? Is I went through and counted what type of wastes each of these guys had set up. So unsurprisingly, all 16 had general waste and all 16 had a mixed recycling bin. What really surprised us was that 14 of them had a separate organics collection, which we weren't expecting to find quite so early in the piece. So that tells me that this sort of high end of town is moving into that space really quickly. The other one I found really interesting was 5 separate soft plastics collections in commercial office buildings in Australia. That was just like, for me, those were sort of the highlights of that particular stuff. Qualitatively, what we found was that bin weights were difficult to get hold of. And so that's why we need to make sure that bin count is easy to use and straightforward, but encourage people through methods such as working with the Better Building Partnership in Sydney to explain how you could do better weight measurements in the future. We also found that separating out that very small retail tenancy, generally the cafe on the ground floor of a commercial office building, was well nigh impossible. So ideally, NABERS likes to separate into office and retail for our energy, and we'll try and do that where we can. So our rules as written state that you can have up to 3 small retail tenancies on site included in this rating, because the average office building generally does have at least 1, maybe 2. What we also found through qualitative findings was that the better performing buildings had a good relationship with their cleaners, and that good data coming from your cleaners and good practice from your cleaners really did make the difference between a good performing building and not so good performing building. And the last one was that whilst we wanted to get facilities insights, we've had to shelve that for sort of 8 months, mostly from an IT development perspective. I ran out of developer time, but also because we want to get it right. And we want to make sure that what we're representing reflects what's actually happening in Australia. And as the China sword policy came through, we went, we'll just put the brakes on that one and take another 8 months to get to that point. So watch this space. We should have some adjustments to it by end of calendar year, everything going well. And I might just stop there. Thank you.